Good morning, Jonathan.
Good morning.
Welcome. Thanks. Thank you for coming. Okay, well, we're going to get started. It's so great to have all of you, and let me tell you a little bit about who I am. I'm Anthony Guillen. I'm the missioner for Latino Hispanic Ministries. That's what I started out with at the Episcopal Church Center as part of the presiding bishop staff, and now am director for ethnic ministries. And I work with a fabulous group of colleagues. I am also a social media evangelist, a digital evangelist, and I believe it's really important. I'll tell you a little bit about that later. If you would like to know more about Latino ministries or ethnic ministries, please follow me on Facebook or Twitter. So our conversation today is why Latinos warrant a serious evangelistic thrust. Oh, before I go any further, let me just find out from you real quick, who's here? So, Jonathan, where are you from?
Spokane, Washington.
Spokane, Washington. It's great. Anna Marie?
Spokane, Washington.
Spokane, Washington. Super.
Houston, Texas.
Houston, Texas. Houston, Texas.
Oberlin, Ohio. Oberlin, Ohio.
Oberlin, Ohio. Welcome. And your name is?
Brian.
Brian?
Diocese
Easton, Maryland.
Yes.
Welcome. And your name?
Barbara Ann Fisher.
Barbara.
I'm the missioner of Church Beyond the Walls.
Church Beyond the Walls. Fabulous. Okay. So, y'all know what this is, right? Iceberg. Okay. So, this is the Latino Hispanic Ministry Iceberg. Our traditional Latino ministry has, the whole concept of the iceberg, or the way that Eric Law uses the iceberg, is that this is the tip, that this is the piece above water that we all see, and then there's the submerged part that we don't see, that it's often sort of ignored. Traditional Latino Hispanic ministry has focused on this piece up here. This is the part that the church really took note back in the 60s and 70s when the immigration began, and all of a sudden people were seeing that there were Latinos in their neighborhood. It was like, oh my God, it's like, what do we do? The part that's not been noticed is the group that's been here forever, because they've been sort of into mainstream USA. People like myself who were through second, third generation, we've just sort of blended in. But the church took note of this massive group of immigrants and first generation, which is about a third of the population of this country. Now, this is the USS Episcopalian right here. And that's the group that's kind of been pushing, calling the church to pay attention to that ministry. But the piece that's virtually ignored is this 2/3 of Latinos, which is about 65% of the population. And those are the second, third, and fourth generation Latinos, who are by the most part, bilingual, bicultural. And they're English dominant. So what we believe that we need is a new paradigm, a paradigm that is a multi-generational, multicultural Latino ministry that takes us away from first generation. Not that the first generation should not be ministered to, not that the church should not be concerned about first generation Latinos. However, when all of your energy is going to 1/3, and there's 2/3 of a population that's not being looked at, thought about, targeted, we're not looking at what this group, with the potential that there is here in this group. And this is the group that I feel that we have a real edge. So let me show you some demographics, and this is the part that we kind of are aware of. You might want to get a little closer. These maps here are U.S. Census Bureau maps. All those little lines are the counties in those states. The dark blue areas are counties where 25% or more of the population is Latino. This was 1980. This was 1990. And you can see that this is kind of where many of us would, when you think of Latinos, you think, Miami, you think Texas, the borderland here, New Mexico, Arizona, California. And in 1990, there was beginning to grow in the Oregon, Washington area. And in 2000, that began to spread out, and we begin to see lots of growth in the eastern border over here, around the Virginia area, North Carolina, and of course the Chicago area. And now areas like Wyoming and Colorado are really beginning to fill out. And then here we have 2010, where Latinos are now sort of everywhere USA here, including Hawaii and Alaska. I mean, even this part of the country up here, I mean, this is all fishing for the most part, and some oil. And here we can see the difference between 1980 and 2010. That is 30 years of expansion. And that's what sort of grabbed people's attention. I mean, people were noticing all of a sudden, they're in our schools, and there's small businesses that are cropping up everywhere. But what was, and the church began to see that we needed to respond. Now, a lot of this, or some of this, initially were the first generation, the immigrant population that came in, because they were either fleeing political unrest or just starving and needing to support their families. And so people were coming in waves. You also remember there's huge economic growth in this part of the country, a lot of building. So a lot of Latinos went to Georgia, Virginia, North Carolina. Part of it was fields, part of it was construction. Louisiana, huge influx of Latinos after Hurricane Katrina. Large population there. Florida, huge Puerto Rican population, originally Cuban. Today there's probably more Puerto Ricans than there are Cubans, and there's probably more Venezuelans than there are Cubans. Maybe that's not quite true, but there's a huge influx of Venezuelans that have come into Florida. And the Venezuelans that have come in the last 10 to 20 years, they're not picking crops. They're living in high-rise, multi-million-dollar high-rises on Key Biscayne and other parts of Florida. They're educated, they're business people. Now, currently we have 57 million or so Latinos in this country, and that makes the United States the second largest Latino country in the world. Mm. Yeah, I saw that. You didn't say it, but I saw that. Wow. Yeah. Second largest Latino country in the world. Now, we're not the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world, because as I mentioned, 2/3 of those Latinos are English dominant. Some of them don't speak any Spanish at all. So we're not the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. We're the second largest Latino country in the world. However, so we're probably, I would say, if we were talking about language, it would be Mexico, Spain, U.S. So we're probably third largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. We are the second largest Latino country in the world in terms of culture, in terms of the peoples. And we know that that immigration is on the decline. There are many millions of Latinos that are leaving and going back, across the border, back home, or even at least to Mexico, because of all the anti-immigration, policies that people have experienced in this country. We also know that the average age for Latinos in the U.S., U.S.-born Latinos, average age 19. Average age of the foreign-born Latinos is 27 years. So, so the average age of that 2/3 population is very young. They're 19. They're probably in college. They're thinking about the future. They're tech savvy. They're getting married. They're in the workforce. But it's a very fast growing segment of the Latino population. About 75% of U.S. Latinos are either bilingual or English dominant, while only 29% of Latinos only speak Spanish. And so, when you think about Latino ministry, one of the things that often comes into people's heads is what? If you're going to reach out to Latinos, what's the first thing you think of? You got to be bilingual. You got to speak Spanish. And so what I'm suggesting is that that's not necessarily the case. We did I think it was in Columbus. We had a workshop at General Convention where we had a number of Latino millennials, also known as NGLs, New Generation Latinos. We had about 7 or 8 Latinos that were at General Convention, and these were all young adults, and they spoke about themselves, and they all ended their little presentation with, "And you don't have to speak Spanish to invite me to church." And these are people that we see on the street, and a lot of people see them and would never think to even speak to them because the assumption is, I can't talk to them. I have people stop. I live in a pretty nice neighborhood in Southern California, and I like to do gardening, and I have a fairly nice yard, and I have neighbors who will stop by on Saturday or Sunday and roll down their window and ask for my phone number. Assuming that I'm the gardener, and so you see people like myself. You see us on the street, you see us in the store, see us in the mall, and you might acknowledge them, but a lot of people will just not even say hello because they think, well, I can't talk to them. So let's see here. I'm going to just go by that. So what we need is we need a paradigm shift. So let me define a little bit about the generations. So we have first and what we call the 1.5 generation, second, third, and fourth. And when you consider doing Latino Hispanic ministry, you have to consider the generation. Who's the generation in your neighborhood? Now, how do you find that out? Well, there's some telltale signs, but there's a number of ways to do that. One is the use of demographics. One of the resources that the Episcopal Church has is that we have a subscription with a company called Mission Insight. Has anyone ever used Mission Insight? Okay, a few of you. Okay, Mission Insight. If you go to the Episcopal Church webpage and look up studying your congregation, it'll take you to a page where you can put down the name of your diocese, select your diocese, select your congregation, and then there is a demographics report to profile. And that will give you a 3-mile radius report of your congregation or any congregation that you want to look at. That report is, I think, $85 each. And we have a subscription, so we every January we create a new profile for each congregation in the Episcopal Church, and you can download that for free. So that's a resource we provide. Now, many dioceses also subscribe to Mission Insight, and so you can ask your diocese to do a specific report for your congregation with different parameters. You can collect, say, for instance, in your area, there's 4 zip codes that are near your congregation. You could do a study by zip code, 1 or 3 or a combination of zip codes. You can do it by county, you can do it by city, or you can go in to the Google map and actually just draw the area that you want, and you'll get the study for that particular area, down to a block. So you can get a study of where you want to look at. Say, for instance, at 5 miles from your area, there's an area where you see that there's a lot of Latinos who have moved into that area. You want to learn a little bit more about them. Go in there and you can ask somebody who has a subscription to it to go in there and get you that information. And you can find out what kind of work they do, what language they speak at home, what the age group is, how many people are married, how far they drive to work. All those kinds of things you can find out through Mission Insight. So doing a demographic study is really helpful. It'll give you a great picture. And this Mission Insight is updated 4 times a year because they don't just do the reports based on the census. Because you can get free census report studies. But the census only gives you, that's only people who report. So Mission Insight contracts with 3 different companies that provide other kinds of information. Because even though a person may not be reported by the census, the grocery stores know what they eat. The banks report who their accounts are with. So if you want information, Mission Insight or a company like that puts all that information together into one easy report for you to read. So I'm a real believer in that. There's also lots of free information. If you just type in Latinos in my community or Latino census for 2017, all this stuff will come up from different sources that you can get. So that's one way you can find out. How's another way that you can go get information? Drive around. But even better than driving around, walk around. And what might you do when you walk around? Where would you want to go? Grocery stores? Pardon?
We have a grocery store chain in Florida called Presidente.
Presidente. Okay, so go to the Presidente. Where else would you want to go to? Parks? If people are hanging around. I would recommend you go to restaurants.
Wendy's.
Go to a Latino restaurant and talk to the manager or the owner because they will have a wealth of information. Or any place that provides a social service. Some schools, some school officials might be willing to share some time with you. Go to other denominations, especially some of the storefront churches, because they're going to tell you what they've found, what they've learned, and what they found out. We had a church plant a number of years ago in Florida. They actually were doing reaching out to the Portuguese-speaking population, mostly Brazilian, but also some people from Portugal. There's a lot of them in both in Maryland and in Florida. And so they went to the restaurants, they went to the grocery stores, they went to I think some clinics, and they went to all the other denominations, and they actually got from all of these congregations, all these storefronts, they gave them their income, basically the copies of their budget. I mean, they asked, it's like, how many people do you have here, and what kind of income do you have? And they gave them all this information, and they learned that all those storefronts, all those little storefronts, they may have only had 100 people, but they were all tithing. And then they learned how many Roman Catholics were attending Spanish Mass, and of course they couldn't get a full picture of that, but they were able to glean a picture of how much most of those parishioners gave, and so they had an idea of what the potential was out there. So anyway, learning who your community is will be very, very helpful. A lot of the things that we've done, this is across the church, not just Latinos, but a lot of the mistakes that we've made in church planting is that people with very good intentions, with a good heart, decide it's time to plant a church somewhere or to start or to redevelop a congregation without doing all of the background stuff. And then, we wonder why it wasn't successful. Most businesses, you would not build a shopping center in an area unless you've done your market study. You know who the customer is, what their income is, what they want. I mean, it would make no sense to build a shopping center in a relatively poor community and bring in stores like Neiman Marcus and in Saks Fifth Avenue. I mean, you just know not to do that. But when we open churches up, it's like, I had somebody tell me that they started a Latino ministry and they hired a mariachi band and that nobody came. Well, who were the Latinos in your community? They were Puerto Ricans. I mean, it's just like, you just have to do some basic study who is in your community. And knowing the generations is really helpful. So, first generation, these are the foreign-born immigrants. These are the people that immigrated as young adults or older. The first 1.5 generation are the foreign-born children who were brought to the U.S. before the age of 4 or 5. So 1.5 generations. Now, if you know Nancy Frausto, she'll tell you that she came over when she was 7 years of age. So she's not really considered, well, she'd be kind of a first 1.5 generation. The second generation is a person born in the U.S., but where at least one of their parents is foreign-born. Third generation is a person born in the U.S. with U.S. born parents and at least one foreign-born grandparent. And the fourth generation is a U.S.-born person with both parents born in the U.S. and both of their grandparents born in the U.S. And each one of these has different needs, and there's different ways of addressing this group. So how do we translate that information into a strategy is kind of the question. So I was speaking with Maggie yesterday, and Maggie, you're working here in Ohio with primarily recent immigrant population, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, they're not recent, they're
not
first
recent.
Generation, but like 10, 15 years ago.
Okay, 10 or 15 years ago, okay. So they were born, and they came probably as adults, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So they're now married here and they're raising their children. Mm-hmm. So their children are now 1.5, right? Okay. And Jonathan, you're in Oregon?
Washington.
No, Spokane.
Yeah.
Sure, you're in Washington.
Yeah.
And what do you know about the Latinos in your community?
Spokane's a predominantly white city, so the percentages are lower than they are on the western side of the state. But yeah, there is, in particularly where I am in my neighborhood, that's where most of the people of color, Black, Latino, Asian live. But overall, I mean, it's about 7% of the total population of Spokane, but roughly 40% of that 7% live close to where my parish.
Where your parish is?
Yeah.
And do you know what generation they are?
They're primarily second generation.
Second generation.
Yeah. The elementary school is 50% students of color and white, and it's by and far the most of any school in the county.
In the county.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of second generation Latinos.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So knowing what that group is really helpful in when you create a strategy. Knowing what group you're in, what group you're talking about. So one of the things that the office has been talking about for a number of years now is the need for cultural competency. Because if most of those folks are second generation, the likelihood is that most of them are English speaking. You know, that if you were looking at census data or a Mission Insight report, you would find out that 70 or 80% of them speak English at home. So if they speak English at home, they work in English, they study in English, their Spanish is not going to be a major factor, but culture is still a very important factor. And so the need for cultural competency is really important. So I'm going to do a plug here for a program that the Office of Latino Hispanic Ministry has and offers you. We have a program called the Episcopal Latino Ministry Competency Course, or we should call it ELMC for short. And it's a 8-day intensive program where a person comes. It's directed really sort of for Anglos, but we have a lot of Latinos that come too. I'm a Latino. I'm Mexican American, born and raised in Texas, but I grew up as much as I could. I grew up as an Anglo. The way of thinking, I was ashamed of being Mexican. I wanted to be white, and I wanted to marry somebody white. And to me, everything that was beautiful was white. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s that God sort of turned me around. I had a conversion experience in terms of ethnicity, race, and heritage, and language. And I'm very thankful for that experience. It was a painful experience, but it was a good one. And but the where was I going with that? Oh, the cultural competency course. Thank you. But I had to learn a lot about the culture, and I made a lot of mistakes in my ministry, in my early ministry, because I didn't understand the culture. Because I think Episcopal and I think Anglo, and so in a short little story. My first year in my parish, it was an Anglo congregation that wanted to reach out to the Latino community. 76% of the population in Oxnard, California at that time was Latino. Today it's closer to 80 something. But back then it was 76%. And there were no Latinos in the congregation, and the church wanted to grow. And they wanted a youth group, and they wanted children, and they wanted children in the Sunday school because there was no children left. We were down to 2 children when I arrived there. The average age of the congregation was 76 years. So 76 was the average age of the congregation, white, and 76% was the population, the Latino population in the community. So it made no sense to not reach out to that community. I arrived in January. Lent comes real close, real soon. So I began to think about Lent. And so I thought about Easter and began to make preparations for Easter. And I knew that Ash Wednesday was important. So I figured we probably would have some Latinos come if we really made the push. So immediately when I arrived, we began to make preparations for Ash Wednesday. And I was thinking really big. I thought if we get 50 to 75 people, from the community, this is going to be like a really great kickoff. So we put a lot of energy into getting the word out, flyers, knocking on doors, letting people know that we had a sign in front of the church, Ash Wednesday, service at 7 o'clock at night. Well, the church sat like 250 people. We had the place packed. There were people standing at the back of the door, outside. There were so many people. And I thought, oh my God, this is fabulous. And so I announced in the middle of the service, I said, we're going to have Good Friday services at 7 o'clock every Friday here, and you're all welcome to come. That Friday, nobody showed up. Next Friday, nobody showed up. Third Friday, nobody showed up. Fourth Friday, nobody showed up. I'm thinking, it's like, and so we're still putting out information. Good Friday's, way of the cross. Nobody comes. So I'm thinking, okay, maybe it's just a fluke. Maybe it was just Ash Wednesday. So I'm not prepared for the really big service, which is, anybody have any idea? Nope. Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday. I'm not thinking like a Latino. No, I wasn't thinking about how big Palm Sunday is in Latin America. Palm Sunday, church is packed with Latinos, and I wasn't ready for them. So I'm thinking, oh wow. So we'd already planned a bilingual Easter vigil. Nobody comes. Easter Sunday, there's hardly anybody there. They were there Ash Wednesday and Palm Sunday. Now, in my Anglo formation thinking, why weren't they there for Easter? Anybody know why they weren't there for Easter? Any ideas? When I was in Mexico as a missionary, even there, I was noticing some of this stuff, and I asked a number of people that came to our church why Jesus came. Now, if you ask people in the street here, you know, if you were to go into a lot of churches, why did Jesus come? Tell me, why did Jesus come?
To save the world.
To save the world? Why else?
To die for our sins.
What's that?
To die for our sins.
To die for our sins, to save us, to give us new life, right? The response I got from this is Mexico, of course. The response I got was, Jesus came to teach us how to suffer. So does Palm Sunday resonate a lot more with that than Easter? So if you understand that, that will help you tremendously. So, going back to the course, ELMC. We have 2 courses this summer, June in Claremont, California, and in Sewanee in August, in Sewanee, Tennessee. It's an 8-day intensive course. If you go to Latino, I'll give you my business card if anybody wants it. If you just follow me on Facebook, Anthony Guillen, you'll see information about ELMC. So recognizing that for second and third and fourth generation, it's not Spanish, but it is cultural competency that is essential. And that for many multi-generational Latinos, especially those who are 35 and under, they feel much more comfortable in a cross-cultural setting in worship. But a lot of the congregations that I'm aware of that do bilingual worship, they do it with a English-speaking congregation and a Spanish-speaking congregation. And for the most part, that does not work. Everybody's frustrated. Everybody gets left out half of the time. It's not the ideal. Bilingual worship works best when you've got bilingual people that feel comfortable moving back and forth. But it's not the ideal, and it's not what I would recommend for starting a Latino ministry in an Anglo congregation. Now, there's in some settings it can work, but it's really hard. It's really hard. So, here's kind of a breakdown of the generations. About 20% of Latinos are first generation. About 20% of Latinos are first generation. And there's about 16% that are the 1.5 generation. There's 40% that are second generation. 40% of Latinos are second generation, and they're not in our Episcopal churches for the most part. I believe we are missing an incredible opportunity. The Pew Forum report, and then 24% are third, fourth, fifth generation and up. These folks here, they are as American as apple pie. Except that when it comes to Thanksgiving, they'll have turkey and dressing and green beans and tamales or tortillas or arepas or any other number of things along with. At home, we always had cornbread dressing, green beans, mashed potatoes, and gravy, and tortillas and beans. And after the meal, we had lunch. We'd have a big Thanksgiving lunch, and for dinner, we would heat up the tortillas and we'd put the cornbread dressing and the turkey in it, and we'd eat turkey and dressing tacos. We couldn't wait for that. That was really kind of the big thing, was to eat the tacos in the evening for dinner, because we loved the cornbread dressing inside the tortilla. But that's that. So you can see that distinction when it comes to the cultural stuff. We don't leave that behind. And there's a major cultural tension between the first generation and the second, third, and fourth generation. This group here can flow easier into these areas. But most congregations you'll seldom see a generation, a Latino congregation where there's third and fourth generation Latinos who are very, very Anglo in their thinking and so many things, and the first generation all sort of living together. You'll see some, but very few people can flow back and forth very easily. But these folks can move in easier. So up to now, any questions or comments? I'm just throwing a lot of information out, so please. Yes.
Situation that we're dealing with in our diocese, and
you're Barbara.
Yes.
From
Easton,
Maryland.
That I'm actually doing a big site visitation there tomorrow with the bishop is in ministry situations where you have undocumented immigrants that you're wanting to provide like church support for, that they are coming together for ministry, but there's also that real live fear right now of ICE and what's going on at the governmental level, in DC. How do you begin to provide the support and encouragement for that? Like, I know that there's grant money, ECW and that, but you don't want to openly identify or pinpoint where this is going to exist. How do you minister?
Where you don't want it to, you don't want to pinpoint the place where the ministry is going to happen, or?
Right. Well, some of the people are afraid, like they've had this kind of underground going on.
Right.
But the diocese is wanting to begin to offer support and encouragement and make it more of an identified type ministry.
Right.
How do you begin to work in that? Are there things within TAC that are available to provide support and understanding for how to really go about working within that?
I don't know that that we're. I mean, the obvious office that has some experience in that is Episcopal Migration Ministries. Now they obviously operate more in the area of resettlement, but they also have experience or some knowledge and networking with people that are helping the immigrants and also I would say that they're the group that you would speak with. What I can say is that if you're going to build want to be a visible, place for that to happen, you've got to build rapport with the community. They've got to know that they can trust you.
And
that's been the thing, obviously.
That's been
so the other thing is you need partners. You need partners in this because if you're gonna want to let everybody know that this is a place where they can come. Obviously, if you let the community know, then the government officials, if they don't already know, will find out. Okay, so that's the fear that once it's public, then they're easy prey. We've had in the past, we've had ICE agents, go to a large Latino congregation, and this happened a number of years ago under that famous Sheriff Joe in Arizona, that went on Easter Sunday or Palm Sunday, I think it was Palm Sunday, and surrounded the church with vehicles waiting for everybody to come out of church. And fortunately, they got a tip during the service, and they just held the people in the church until the bishop came and could confront the agents and would not leave until they left. So you've got to have a plan. Some partners that might be on the lookout for you that can help protect. That if you were to hear that they're out there, that you could garner up some neighbors, some businesses that would come and say, look, folks, we're not gonna let you walk in or whatever. So you're gonna have to create a network in the community to be supportive of you in that area. And that's not my area of specialty. Because I don't know that much about what to do in those cases, but just from what I've heard and learned. Yes, you had a question.
What percentage of
tell me where you're from. Your
South
name?
Florida, Angela Grant, Palm Beach County.
Okay, great.
So I'm just wondering what percentage of our Latino population attend church, and I'm assuming the largest number are attending Catholic churches or Jehovah's Witnesses.
Well, Latinos are not going to church. I mean, we are probably the largest percentage of churchgoers in terms of a group in this country. I don't remember the figures, but I think the overall U.S. attendance at church, we used to be something like 60-something%. I think we're down around 40. In Europe, anybody know what the percentage of people go to church?
0.
No, it's not 0, but it's pretty close. Anybody have an idea?
5%.
It's under 2%. Under 2%. And in Spain, it's around 0.5% of people that go to church. So in this country, we're not that low yet. But we're quickly heading in that direction. Because I would say if you looked at figures from the 80s, 70s and 80s, when our churches were full, it was a very large percentage, and today it's quite low. What were you going to say?
I had a comment. One of the reasons why we're doing work with a lot of second-generation Latinos in the context of college ministry, and they did a study. University of Houston has like 45,000 students and a large percentage of Latinos, and they did a study of sort of like the drop-off rates from like high school attendance of church to college attendance of church among Anglos, and they divided up like Anglos, Latinos, African Americans, and the drop-off rate for Latinos was even more significant than it was for Anglos, which really surprised
Oh, now that's interesting.
and so we've been asking, like, so what is that about, right? Is it are people asking sort of like different questions? Is this part of a self-differentiation piece that's sort of natural in college anyway, but then you also have sort of like a self-differentiation happening in terms of culture at the same time from the immigrant generation. So there's
That's interesting. So was those figures U.S. figures or were those Texas figures?
That was
or just a
University
of Houston study
with about 45,000.
For 45,000 students. Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I think along with that, a question that I'm curious about is the Latinx movement and second generation, younger aged second generation. So you have like the broader generation stuff happening with millennials or whatever the categories are that are behind, coming up behind millennials, and this interest in like understanding more indigenous, like going further back into cultural roots and heritage. Is that a relatively new thing, or has that been a desire of Latinos second generation? Is that a common thread among like second and third generation to sort of kind of move further back into that? And I wonder if that's a piece of that, because just anecdotally with people that I know, friends of mine around the country, that's very much of interest for them, and of course they tend to be in their 30s or younger,
right?
Just because that's my age bracket too, and so I'm just curious about that. If you know anything around that anecdotally,
as to why why that age group is sort of leaving sort of the church.
Well, if there's a connection between that leaving the church, if there's a connection with wanting to go back to more indigenous practices or understandings or things of that nature.
Yeah, I don't see that. I don't see the indigenous part. Okay. I don't see the indigenous part. We know that millennials across the board have grown up in a whole different world. There's a lot more acceptance of diversity, racially and obviously gender. Tremendous amount of intermarrying. I just saw a report. I was telling my wife about it a couple days ago. Who's sort of intermarrying with who, and especially by gender. So it's really interesting that Asian women are in the U.S. are married more outside of the Asian culture than the males. Black males marry more outside their group than females. And Latinos, it's mostly Latinas that marry outside. So real interesting how that's, but there's a lot of intermarrying, and that study also was indicating who was marrying who ethnically, and so there's a lot of intermarriage, a lot of acceptance of different cultures and different practices. So one of the things that I was going to mention is it's still, I think, a valid study. It's called the Pew Forum report. It was 1998. Yes, 1998. No, I'm confused. 2000. When were we at General Convention in Anaheim? 2009. Okay, 2009. Okay, so the Pew Forum report was a report done in 2004 called "Changing Faiths: Hispanics in America," and it was a very large market sample that they did the study from. And one of the things that was really telling for us, that was really helpful, and it continues to be the case, is that there's a correlation between, they use the word conversion or for change, that there was a correlation between language and generation and change. First generation Spanish-speaking Latinos were 1/3 less apt to change or to convert to another denomination than were second and third generation, who were more English-speaking and had been here longer and more enculturated. So there's a correlation between enculturation, length of time, and language. The more English you speak, the longer you've been here, the more likely you are, because you're more open to change than first generation Spanish speaking. And yet, our ministry has been first generation immigrants, and it's been a much longer, slower process, to bring, some of those folks on board.
Anthony, remember a few years ago we were doing marketing research, and we intentionally went to the Latino community, and these were why the Episcopal Church? Why did you land in the Episcopal Church? And I was just wondering if some of those things that we found out about that still hold true, or if it's, it was the women especially, they loved having first of all, it's a tradition. They're Episcopal and Catholic, it's not too far away from what their culture was. But second, they loved seeing either women in the pulpit or married, because family is so, and children are so important, that they loved somebody that they could relate to a little a little more. And I didn't know if any of that stuff still, there were lots of other reasons as well, but and it's always about the inviter, somebody invited them.
If somebody invited them, that came across really loud in all those interviews. Yeah, I think that those are still some factors. Women at the altar, married clergy, I think those are the approachability of clergy are big factors. But I would say that from my experience and from what I've seen and heard, Latino millennials overall are less, and so this study at U of H is really interesting. I would love to see that, and I would love to see if there's other reports like that, because the information I have is that Latino millennials are much more, for the most part, apt to appreciate, respect, honor their parents and their grandparents' faith traditions than their counterparts. So overall, we find that they may drop off in terms of church, especially when they go off to school. So that would be a different. If students leave home like the rest of their counterparts, then there's probably going to be a lot more differentiation.
But that's not the story.
But they're at home because they're commuters. They're commuters. So that's what's interesting. That's what I would find really interesting, because normally if you live at home, at least this was my experience in the church, and Carlos, I don't know if this has been your experience, but or Samuel, but I found that Latino millennials, young adults who still lived at home, even though they came in different cars to church, they came together as a family. Even if they were, mid-20s, it was still expected that if you lived at home on Sunday morning, you all went to church together. And that's been my experience across the country as I've visited places, as I've spoken with folks, is that a lot of our churches have a lot of Latino millennials because there's still that, that respect and expectation.
I think that gets at kind of the question that I was asking. I was using the word indigenous inappropriately.
Okay.
I wasn't necessarily just meaning that.
Okay.
But respecting the tradition.
Yes.
And kind of hearkening back to it in ways that maybe an older or a Gen X or a boomer, second generation Latino might not have.
Might not have. Yes. I did an informal study at Sewanee, of all places. All of you know where Sewanee is? Okay.
Holy Mountain.
Okay. So, Daniel Velez and I went to Sewanee, University of South in Tennessee, about 4 or 5 years ago. We were visiting fellows for 2 weeks. And our plan was to visit with the NGLs, the New Generation Latinos, the Latino Millennials, who were studying at Sewanee. Now, we knew that there were two. Because they were Latina PKs, so we knew of them. So we figured at least we'll talk with them too. We didn't have any idea how many more there might be. Student body's around 2,000, so we didn't expect it to be very high. We went there and we found out that there were actually 85 Latinos at Sewanee. Wow. 20 of them were international students. So these were mostly wealthy Latinos that their parents were paying out-of-state tuition to go to Sewanee from Venezuela and from Spain. Okay, the rest of them, so about 65, were U.S. born, or they were 1.5 generation, and they had gotten a scholarship to go to Sewanee. So we visited, out of those 65, we visited with 25. So about a third of the Latinos, we actually sat down and visited with them, and we wanted to find out about, so how many of you, we told them who we were, we're both priests, Episcopal priests, and we'd like to talk with you about your, in fact, there was a Spanish club on campus, and there was an invitation that was sent out and said, the president of the group sent out an invitation on email saying next Monday night, these 2 Episcopal priests are going to be here, and they want to come to our meeting, and we want to invite you to come and talk with them about, they're doing a study about Latinos, students and church. So 25 came to this gathering, and they normally had around 15 that would come on Monday nights for dinner. So 25 Latinos came, and we told them, this is our study, this is what we want to find out. So we said, so how many of you are believe in God, or have some sort of relationship with God and the church? All the hands went up except for one. So out of 25, 24 hands went up. They all believed in God and had some connection to church. So we said, okay, well, of those 24, of all of you, how many of you go to church regularly? About 22, 23 hands went up. At a college. We said regularly, more than once a month. It's like, so, okay. How many of you go to church at the chapel? For those of you in Sewanee, the beautiful Gothic, church on campus. Nobody raised their hand. It's like, okay, so where do you go to church? 2 of them went to an evangelical, either InterVarsity, or they went to some vineyard, or they went to some non-denominational church. So where did the rest of you go? Well, they all went to Catholic church. They went to a Catholic church 22 miles down the road. They put their money together to rent vans to go to church. Their money to rent a van on Sunday to go to church as a group. So we want to know, what's the draw? What's the draw there? And so we asked, okay, for those of you, if you don't go to church, what do you do? 3 of them said, Sunday night, I say the rosary in my room. So, these were kids, college kids, that were studying, they were pre-med, they were biology students, they were, they wanted to be lawyers, they were, these, one wanted to be a politician. These were, Latinos that were educated, they were going to college, their parents weren't around, nobody was making them go to church, and they were even putting their money together to go to church. They wanted to go to church. That was really amazing for us to find that out. Now, the interesting thing is we went to that church with them that next Sunday because we wanted to check this place out. Neither one of us found it very stimulating. The sacristy was in what we would call the narthex. When you walk in, to the left was the sacristy. And the priest was vesting and saw us both walk in with our collars with a bunch of students. The kids all walked in and we stood there for a little bit. Looked at the priest. He looked at us. Continued to vest, never said hello to us. And we went and sat down. Music wasn't great. Sermon was okay. When we came out, the kids had a big smile on their face. I call them kids. And we said, well, how was it? And they go, oh, it was wonderful. We just loved it. And it's like, they go, and so we just feel so happy. That was the word that kept saying, we feel happy. What was it? So we went back. What we determined based on their conversation, what the college students found at that church, it wasn't the liturgy, it wasn't the preaching, it wasn't really even the music. It was being with people like them. And two, it was seeing the intergenerational. Because they saw the grandparents, they saw the kids, the babies, they saw they could see their siblings, they could see their family, all, portrayed right there in that group. So it touched their heart. It touched their heart. And maybe that might even have been more of a reason for going there than even God. I don't know. But they made an effort to go to church together as a group. And there was no coffee hour afterwards. As soon as that service was over, it was gone. So it wasn't even like they went there for the Mexican food afterwards. They went just to Mass, and they felt happy. Now, when we asked them about what does the church need to know from you? What would you like if the Episcopal Church were to offer you a service here at the chapel? What would it require? What would it need? And the first thing they said was the prayers. We said, what would be your question? Like, which prayers? What would you imagine? What would they say? If you just heard that the prayers were the most important element, what comes to your mind? What prayers?
In Spanish?
Yeah, well, they were saying in Spanish. Huh? Prayers of the people. That's kind of what came to my mind. Prayers of the people. Maybe the Lord's Prayer. They said the one that starts with the Lord be with you and also with you. Lift up your hearts. The Eucharistic prayer. That was for them the most important part in Spanish. They wanted to hear that in Spanish. The next thing was they wanted to hear the music in Spanish. The third thing was they wanted to hear the sermon in English. Because they said, most of them said, we have no idea what they said because we don't understand Spanish. So the sermon in Spanish went right over their head. So they wanted music in Spanish. They wanted the Eucharistic prayer in Spanish. The lessons, most of them were either way. The rest of the prayers, the rest of the liturgy, either way. Sermon English. That's what these Latino millennials were saying to us. That was important to them. And I would guess that as we think about reaching that second and third generation, that 1.5 generation in our ministries, that we ought to take that into consideration. And that's why finding out who's in our neighborhood is so important. How are we for time? It's 10 o'clock. Are we supposed to end? 10:15. I got a few more minutes. Okay, so I've got a lot of stuff here, but I'm not going to go through it. Let me see. Yeah. Oh, here's something real quick. This is not mine. This is from Al Rodriguez. He's a priest in Diocese of Texas. I love this. He talks about the acculturation process. And he says that the acculturation process that we're talking about right now with the different generations, that it's as old as the Bible. So Abraham was an immigrant. He was born in a foreign land. He becomes the first generation of the Hebrew people. Isaac, second generation. He was the bridge to establishing with the Israelites. Jacob was third generation, renamed Israel. You know, Antonio becomes Tone. You know, becomes a true Israelite, moves to Egypt. Joseph is fourth generation. He's sold in Egypt. So, you know, we can see in the Bible how, you know, and so Joseph now becomes Egyptian. So, I mean, it's like a whole nother, you know, culture. And this is the way, you know, this is the way it just works in humanity, you know, and that's what's happening here. So, Joseph acculturates as an Egyptian, but maintains his identity as an Israelite. So, like Joseph, American Latino youth are acculturated into the American culture, language, and basic values, but they grow up bilingual or bicultural. Like Joseph, young Latinos grow up to adjusting culturally and linguistically in a multicultural world. And most multi-generational Latinos feel more comfortable in a bilingual or English-speaking setting. But, as I said, this is true for that generation. However, many of our churches that begin to start Latino ministries where there's an Anglo congregation and they reach out to that first generation Latino and they think, oh, we'll do a bilingual worship. That's not what we're talking about. Because in that setting, it doesn't work because there's not the acculturation. So I do not recommend bilingual worship when you're dealing with an existing Anglo congregation and a first generation Latino immigrant population. In those settings, it does not work. But when you start to do college ministry, the ministry, you know, much of it will be done in English, but with a Latino flavor, right? There'll be components of Latino culture and, you know, in food and in dance and music that will come into it, but the conversation will all be done in English, right? You don't need a Spanish person to come and, you know, talk and deal with, you know, my boyfriend broke up with me, I don't know what to do. You don't need to talk to somebody in Spanish about that, but it would be great if that person understood the culture of how the parents intertwine and the aunt and the uncle and all of that other stuff, because in our settings it's so different. So I'll end by, I have in California where I live, we have a lot of, in Oxnard and Ventura, California, we have a lot of second, third, fourth generation, fifth generation Latinos. And I know a family where, because the families, you know, we're really tight, you know, in a lot of settings. Now, in my family, it's not that way. I mean, I would never want to live at home, you know, with my parents. But I know professionals, doctors and college professionals and stuff who all own their own homes, but nobody lives in those homes that they own. They all live with their parents, with their kids, all in one house. Because the family's always been together, and that's just the way they do it. I know that in my family growing up, no major decision was ever made without my cousins and my aunts and uncles being a part of that conversation. If one of us was going to go off to school, the family got together and talked about it, and the decision was made together. You know, and so the parents and the extended family was an important part of that decision. And to this day, in many Latino families, that's still, you know, maybe not quite that extreme, but there's still a lot of that being together and making corporate decisions, not individual as more of our Anglo culture is. So the future of the Episcopal Church is as you've seen with the demographics, it is the culture is the future of the Episcopal Church is multicultural, multilingual. It won't look quite like that, but there is, as we know, there is a browning of America that's happening. We have a lot of immigrants, and of course, not just Latinos. And one of the things I say to people everywhere when I talk about Latino Hispanic ministry, the things that I'm saying could just as easily apply to the Asians that are in your community, the Africans that have just arrived. There's people from all around the world that are moving. There's tremendous movement, and the church needs to just look outside of its doors. We can no longer be inside. The presiding bishop says that constantly. We cannot be inside. The church has got to go out into the street. Thank you so much. Okay, I've got 5 minutes for questions. Yes, sir.
So there's still a language component that potentially is important.
Yes.
So for somebody like me, identify as white, present as white, right? Speak no Spanish. Should I start attempting to at least learn maybe the Eucharistic prayer in Spanish? Have my congregation start working on some songs, if in fact we do have a Latino population that could potentially come through the door, just so we're started working on that process. Is that a fair thing to do? Even
I would say yes to all of those questions. Yes, learning, when you learn another language, you begin to learn also culture. What a word means. We say goodbye, and we know kind of what that means. We say adios, and it's not just a word. It's a commendation, because we're saying to God.
To God, right?
It's like we're sending you, with God's blessing. Adios. So when you learn a language, you begin to learn other components. Obviously, learn about your particular community. If you happen to be, I would imagine that the majority of people in Spokane are probably Mexican and Central American, right? Yeah. So learn about those cultures. Find out if is it Mexican and Guatemalan, or is it Mexican and Honduran? Different culture, different foods. The way a tamal is made in El Salvador and the way it's made in Honduras is quite different. And so learn about that. Go to restaurants. Ask people. I tell people just go out and ask. There's so many examples of people just going out and finding out things by talking to neighbors and asking, what their needs are and what their concerns are. And that will give you a big tip on how you might respond to that by finding out finding out from them. So yes, learn to enunciate. Make an effort to do some components in Spanish. I know some congregations that have had some incredible ministries just because they made some small changes in the way they do church by letting Latinos know that they're welcome. A short story, and this happened in Pennsylvania somewhere, or New Jersey, Pennsylvania, I think it was. A Latino family showed up one Sunday. They'd never been visited by a church. They were downtown, big church. They were right on the corner. They had 4 doors that came into the main sanctuary. And because that family came that one Sunday, and the priest knew some high school Spanish and was able to learn that they were planning on coming back the next Sunday, he printed the lectionary in Spanish, just the lectionary, just the lessons, and had them 4 copies, one at each door, and said to the ushers, in case this family comes back, give them the lessons in Spanish. Because they got the lessons in Spanish, that family knew that they were welcome, and so they took communion that second Sunday. By the 4th Sunday, they were clearly, this is our church. And so the vestry decided to go to the expense of printing the entire service booklet bilingually so that this couple could follow along. Within a few months, they had invited friends over, and people were beginning to join the church. The worship was still not bilingual. It was in fact, it's never been bilingual. They started a Spanish service separately, but they let them know that they were glad that they were there. Some churches, just begin to sing a few songs every Sunday as a norm for that congregation. And so that gives, if somebody's coming from outside and they hear 1 or 2 songs, it's just like putting flowers or a welcome mat at the door, you know. Nancy, do you have anything you want to throw out? Do you have anything that you'd like to add to what I just said?
No, I mean, I think like the story that you just told is a perfect example. I know in my experience, I now print everything bilingual for both the English service and the Spanish service. Because sometimes English goers show up to the Spanish service to build relationships.
Right.
Now they also feel welcome.
Right.
So all my material is bilingual now.
Right.
And that helps with the younger kids in the Spanish service because they're learning to read English, so now they can follow along with their parents.
Right. Yeah. I highly recommend not bilingual worship, but bilingual resources. So printing the service bilingually every Sunday for every service, it just makes sense. You know, it makes a statement to the congregation. We're in this. We're committed to this. It makes a statement to those who are visiting. You know, an Anglo person walks in off the door, off the street. You know, sits down to worship, and the service is bilingual. They go, "Oh wow!" You know, like there's something going on here. I mean, they may not be interested in worshiping. And I've had people in my congregation that would come to our church when I first went there and we started doing all this stuff. There was a big article in the paper one day, you know, that I was there and what I was doing and stuff. And people started coming to church and they said, "We don't want to worship in Spanish. I don't want to worship bilingually, but I love the fact that you're doing this. And so I want to belong to a church like that." You know, so that was important. So that's the message. Any other question, comment before we leave? Yes, Maggie.
I think something that I struggle with in my congregation is I have a lot of first generation and a lot of like 1.5 to second generation, and I end up doing a lot of things by like preaching bilingually, stuff like that. But I'm wondering if it would be more effective. I'm thinking out loud, specifically about preaching after what you said about your experience with the college students.
I've seen lots of bilingual preaching. It's a gift. I mean, it's really hard, and I think that's where you lose people the most. Is how to preach bilingually. Again, if you have a bilingual congregation, you know, it doesn't matter which language you go to, everybody's kind of with you. But if you're doing folks that only speak English and only speak Spanish, and they're hearing everything going back and forth, however you do it, you're going to lose somebody. And so you have to kind of determine how the congregation can best deal with it. So there, you know, some examples are, you know, a person will speak will speak sort of a line or a thought at a time and go back and forth, you know, little sound bites back and forth. That seems to have the least disconnect, because if it's real quick, the person listening to the one language normally knows that the next sentence is going to be right back in their language, and they can kind of follow you. But that's really hard to do. Other people will do kind of like a whole like a paragraph or a big piece, and then you move to the next big piece. That works in terms of getting a point across, but you lose people, because if I'm talking in English and all of a sudden comienzo a hablar español and I'm over here in español for 5 minutes, or 2 minutes, or 1 minute, by the time I come over here, this group has totally forgotten where you were at. So I don't think that works. Some people will preach bilingually by preaching primarily in one language, like English, and throwing in a few thoughts here and there into Spanish. I find that disruptive, personally, even though, again, I can follow it, but I kind of look around and think, the person that's getting it in the other language, they get like 5 little sentences during a whole sermon, and that's not a sermon. And so some people will preach in one language and print it in the other language. That works best if you're preaching in Spanish and print it in English. Because if you preach in English and expect the Latinos to read it in Spanish, and especially with first generation, some of them don't read. So you already left them out. So it's really tricky. I would suggest there's a church in Burien, Washington that does this, and I think it's the best solution. They work this out after a period of time. The Anglos will meet in like the parish hall, the Latinos or some big room. The Latinos meet in another big room, and they do the liturgy of the word separate. So, the collect's done, they read the lessons in their language, they have a sermon in their language, then they all process in for the offertory. They process in singing, they do the peace, and they continue with the Eucharist, which they do bilingual. And in Washington, St. Elizabeth's, I think it is. I don't remember. It's in the Diocese of Olympia.
Oh, where John Foreman is. Okay.
But I think that kind of a model, even if it's if you have a sermon here, you have a Bible study over here or something. But I think if you did the word separately, you can certainly do the Eucharistic prayer bilingually, and I don't think you'll lose people. Yeah, we gotta go. Thank you so much.
I am on mute.
Gracias. Muchas gracias.